Hello, everybody. It's Tanya here. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to introduce a very important person to me. Someone who early on, when I was a little bit misguided, I was so blessed to have the misfortune to run into. This is Lance Crowley. He was my probation officer when I was 13, and I was so lucky to meet him. In the beginning, I was able to be a part of these wilderness programs. So what they would do is they would get these bad kids and take them out into the wilderness. And it taught me so much about myself. And as an adult, reflecting back and journaling and writing, I realized that Lance was one of the most pivotal people that I was so lucky to be introduced to. And his story is so fascinating because he left probation being a peace officer and became a guidance counselor in recovery, a therapist, a counselor, and is running his own practice. So I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to reconnect with this wonderful person and for him to share a little bit of his story. So hi, Lance. How are you doing?
Hi, Tanya. Nice to see you again after, it's been a few years.
Yeah, thank you so much for being willing and taking your day off to do this with me.
You bet.
So can you tell us,
Can
you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now?
Okay. Well, right now I'm sitting in my kitchen, I am taking a few days off from my practice. My wife and I, Mary, who you also met, she was, I think you probably knew her when you were in middle school. She was a school counselor then, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she and I took you on those wilderness trips, some of them. And so we run a practice called Three Peaks Therapy, Three Peaks like the mountains. And I'm sitting underneath those mountains. They're over here. It's here in Nevada. We got these lovely Sierras next to us. And so I'm sitting under one of those at my house. And so I have been seeing clients. And yesterday I went out and did a mental health outreach program with our local sheriff's office, and we do outreach for folks who are struggling. So now I'm a drug and alcohol counselor and a marriage and family therapist, and that's what I've been doing for about 14 years or so in my own practice. So, during that time, Mary and I have been raising our 19-year-old twins who are now at college, sort of.
Yeah, totally.
In the middle of the creeping corona, they're doing online schooling from their apartments in Reno next to their campus, where I don't even know if they've been on campus yet. So.
Yeah. So are you pretty busy? Do you stay pretty busy or with your business now, or do you try to how are you balancing it with everything going on? Do you got a full workload?
Yes.
Yes, I bet you do.
Yes. It's a challenge to say no and also to carve out time to do other things. But I expect that as the years go by here, the next couple of years, and my twins get closer to completion of college, then we will relax more and work less. So we're looking forward to these next few years. We got three-year lease in our office right now from October 1st. So it's not like we're counting or anything, but after that, we're going to lighten things up.
Is it just the two of you, or do you guys have other people working with you in that?
We have another therapist who rents space from us, who's a friend of ours, and so it's three of us in our office.
Oh, I see. So that's why it's called Three Peaks. That's so cool. Great, wonderful.
Worked out that way. Yeah.
So, if you could tell us a little bit of how you came to be here, what was it like that led you to first become a police officer and a probation officer?
Well, I was never a police officer, and I was a peace officer, I guess, because I went to the academy here in Nevada in 1991. And that was an abrupt change because before that, I was a homeless rock climbing bum living in my car. And somehow I interviewed for a job here in Douglas County, Nevada. And I had literally slept on Foothill Road in the back of my car the night before the interview after about 8 months of traveling around the country, rock climbing and working in outdoor programs in Utah and other places. So that was a long journey from back east, which is where I'm from Massachusetts is where I grew up, from Pennsylvania originally. And so I never anticipated becoming a peace officer at any level. When I was a younger kid, I don't know if you can relate to this, Tanya, but I was what they call a youth at risk, I guess they would say. I got sent on wilderness trips as an underachiever when I was in high school. That was a nice word for it. So I went on wilderness trips when I was probably 14 and 15 years old, thereabouts.
Wow, that's incredible. So this is a long-standing development. Do you have any idea where wilderness trips for at-risk youth started?
Yeah, I do. I've researched a little of that. The philosophy, at least the most recent philosophy, was out of World War II. This guy started a program called Outward Bound, and Outward Bound he was a teacher, a German expatriate in England during World War II, and what they realized is that when the ships went down during the war, that you would think that the kids would be stronger and surviving, but actually the older guys were tougher, and they had more ability to survive hard experiences on the water. And so he tried to do that in his school, and he tried to toughen up people by bringing them on outdoor activities and teaching them a better sense of resilience, and doing that for young people. So that's where the idea of taking people out in the outdoors to create personal growth and enhanced resilience came from. And that turned into Outward Bound, which is a program that still takes people voluntarily or, with an encouragement, some of the kids, to get them out and learn more about themselves and to do better in their future. So those sort of programs I was exposed to when I was a kid. I grew up in Massachusetts near a program called Project Adventure, where it was based, and they do ropes courses, and they take people, instead of bringing them out into the woods for long periods of time, they take them on experiences over a shorter period of time through schools and other sorts of things and field trips. And one of the guys who was involved in the creation of Project Adventure, was one of the earlier instructors, was one of my instructors, who caught me drinking on a canoe trip up in Maine, me and my two friends, and they called our parents and sent us home. So I was kicked off a wilderness trip for breaking the rules when I think I was 16 at that time. My buddy was 18. He was old enough he looked old enough to buy beer. I think he was 17. And so we got kicked off a wilderness trip, just like those wilderness trips I used to take you on, expecting you to obey the rules.
Right. I was pretty good.
That's how I got started in this. Was I got booted from one of those programs, but it always made an impact on me.
Wow.
It was a canoe trip, like a week-long canoe trip in Maine, and it was at the end of the trip, and we were supposed to go rock climbing the next day, and we didn't go.
And this was you had done a few other wilderness trips prior.
Yeah, this was my second summer doing it. The first summer was a ropes course experience in New Hampshire, Sergeant's Camp, Boston University's camp, and a backpacking trip. So that was the first summer that I went, and I went back the next year and did a canoe trip in Maine, and that was where I got booted off, and our parents had to come get us and drive us home 6 hours.
So you connected with these guidance people that were with you on these trips enough to where it left an impression, right? So it must have been a really neat relationship that it left quite the impression on you when you got kicked off. Is that true?
Yes, and so I appreciated especially that even though we got in trouble, that they were very respectful in their interaction with us. And I remember sitting at a picnic table with the two instructors, and the one, there was two of them. There was Jim Grout from Project Adventure. Eventually, he became involved with Project Adventure. He was a youth counselor through a church at the time. And Mike Fisher, who was a football coach in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And so they were the ones who took us on these trips, organized the trips. They were called Beyond Boundaries. I'm going to give them a shout out. And years later, after I got kicked off that trip, never saw Jim again. They did make clear that if I wanted to return the following summer, I could do that. But that was important, was to know that the door was still open, but that since we had broken the rules, we were going to go home now, right? But they did it. They didn't yell. I remember Jim Grout having his head on the table in this picnic table, talking to us about how we broke the rules. Totally chill, not yelling, very respectful, and then sending us home. So years later, I was at a conference that Douglas County Juvenile Probation sent me to in Vermont. It was a youth at risk, wilderness risk management sort of program. I think it's called the Association for Experiential Education, put on this conference, and I went, and Jim Grout was doing a presentation there. Had never spoken to the guy since the day he kicked me off. I walked into the room with a bunch of other people. He looked at me, he said, Lance. I said, Jim. And then we ended up being the class. So he used me as the example. I told him I'd been running trips with teenagers by that point for quite a few years. So
Wow.
that was kind of an important link for me, and a pivotal turning point. When I got kicked off the trip, we had been canoeing and we were supposed to go rock climbing the next day, and I didn't get to go because I broke the rules. So when I got the job out here, I was on the end of an 8-month rock climbing trip where I had found other ways to go rock climbing, and had gone through a program at Greenfield Community College called the Outdoor Leadership Program. And that was after I got my bachelor's degree. I realized that's what I wanted to do with my English degree, other than deliver pizza and paint houses, which is what I was doing with my English degree. I didn't want to teach. I hated school.
Yeah.
So I went back for a 1-year certificate program in outdoor leadership, learned how to rock climb, learned how to do other outdoor stuff. And that's how I ended up working with kids like you in, a community-based wilderness program here in Douglas County, Nevada.
Yeah, so it's so cool that they did that. There's something to be said about just taking a person, a child, whoever, and taking them out of their life's context and dropping them into the wilderness. Just by removing someone from the story of their life, their contextual environment, you already make a difference. But by then the immersion of being in the wilderness is just phenomenal.
Is that what you found? Is that what you found to be true?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So getting out of context was the most meaningful thing for me, absolutely, in my life, the things that have changed me. And then being immersed in wilderness, I just, looking back, my ability to connect with who I really am unfolded in the wilderness and I just have to say that I really believe in the natural world. The patterns of the environment unfolded the patterns of my mind. So the stories that I told myself were nothing in comparison to the patterns of the trees and the root structures and the wilderness. So absolutely, those experiences with you I'm so grateful to be pulled out of my environment. It was the first time growing up that I felt free. It's so crazy. And you sent me all those pictures that you had saved, and I mean, there's a huge smile on my face. It meant a ton to me. I felt so free. Also, I just have to say that I remember a lot of things that you said to me were just encouraging. And for some reason, I remembered them always, to the point where I remember packing a backpack and packing a bunch of socks. And you told me that, I did a really good job organizing my socks. Like, I remember that. Like, that's crazy. And then I also remember saying, I really am such an enthusiastic person. I think I'm going to go into advertising. And you were like, no, you're not going into advertising. And that always stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to do that. Like,
Pushy.
You can do better than that, Tanya. And I'm so happy that I have. So yeah, they were super valuable experiences to me. So now, does that relate to you now as you moved out of being a probation officer, and what led you in your heart of hearts to make that trajectory change?
Well, it was interesting. I worked with youth at risk programs, they called it. That was the phrase. In New Jersey, I worked with kids who were out of lockup, from inner city kids from Newark, New Jersey, a program called Project Use in New Jersey. Led some wilderness trips there. And I'm not sure who was leading who. It's always a question, isn't it? Here's the quote I was taught by one of my mentors. He said, it's a poem. It says, "I must hurry, for there they go, and I am the leader." Right? So it's not clear who's leading leading who. It's like a big dog on a leash, when you take kids in the woods. So I worked with kids back east. I worked with kids in Utah for a program called Wilderness Conquest for a summer. That was interesting, from a nice Mormon family that was running an outreach program, as a lot of programs are run by folks with some backgrounds like that. And what I always was curious about, when I worked with these kids for, a few days or a couple weeks or a couple months, is I wondered how they turned out. And I still wonder how some of these kids are doing, right? That I got to know pretty well over these pretty intense experiences, going backpacking or canoeing or rock climbing or other sorts of activities that they would do, or just sitting around the campfire. And that's really where I was introduced to the idea of counseling, was with some of these mentors, where I was the support staff. I'd be teaching rock climbing or leading the backpacking trip, but these counselors would come in and sit with these kids around the campfire, or just experienced leaders, and talk to these kids about their lives. And that's where I found that was more interesting to me, was the talking to kids and understanding what was going on and helping them to change their thinking and behaviors. So, but I always wondered how they would turn out. So I remember leaving that job in Utah, and I had heard about the job in Douglas County, and I was driving down the road in Wyoming, I think I was, and saying, wow, I wonder how people turn out. I would really like to see how, and maybe I need to find a place, a community where I can kind of see how people turn out, right? And not just get to know them for a piece of time and then they go back to wherever they came from, right? And hey, now I know how you turn out.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, so far so good. I mean, 38 years old, figuring it out now. This year feels like a great big year for me. I'm super happy to gain the courage to embrace kind of my enthusiasm and big heart. And I'm really excited to see what I can do with it. So,
yeah.
But yeah, so that
was 30 years ago that I mean, 1991 was when I started working at juvenile probation in Douglas, and got to start working with kids like you from a community. And now I've literally gotten to see, I'm almost into the third generation of folks. I've had kids who used to go on trips with you, bring their kids to me and to Mary for counseling, and now some of them are starting to have their own kids. So I think we're probably getting close to retirement here.
Yeah.
Generation. So.
Well, first of all, I think that that's crazy. Your story is so awesome. Have you considered writing a book? Have you started a memoir at all?
Oh, you mean Mr. Got my English degree in literature back in the 80s, and always had grand plans to write a great American novel. Oh, no, it's never even crossed my mind to write.
Wow.
It's an ongoing writer's block thing that I've dealt with since being a student. So I have about this many journals, right, on a shelf. And also I write a lot of substance abuse evaluations for courts.
Oh, I see.
Right now I have like 3 of those. So unfortunately, I've been writing my great American novel in little confidential packets that end up getting shredded,
Yeah, still a meaningful contribution to humanity.
Yeah. So maybe eventually I'll sit down and write something a little more lasting.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that you really wanted to see how kids turned out when you had already yourself, because of the program, turned out good. It's like it wasn't enough to watch yourself kind of evolve.
Work in progress, aren't we?
Right, absolutely. But it's really cool that you were able to see people grow and progress. So what's different now, the way you work with humanity than it was then? I know that you've really landed in who you are, and it's so cool that you're doing this practice with your wife as well. But what's different about the practice you do now, in contrast to what you did then?
I've always struggled with the idea of kind of control and power and control, and the role that can play in either helping or hurting. And so I always struggled in the job at juvenile probation. I worked there for 10 years as a probation officer, and I never liked the handcuffs and the detention cells and sending kids to programs where, for the most part, they were okay programs or sometimes help kids, but I always so worried about the kind of element of taking away choice. And in Project Adventure, what they teach is challenge by choice, right? Where you engage in an activity, you're told about the activity, you either get to say yes or no to the activity. And in those sort of programs where there's not much choice, or they're told they gotta go, it can take away a little of that choice. And when I ran the wilderness trip, I think I kind of would suggest or say, hey, hey, I'm doing this trip, or are you willing to go? And rather than just saying you got to go. And there were some kids that had to go, but as much as possible, I tried to make it still a choice to decide at least what trip they wanted to do and stuff like that. And so I prefer in my private practice now that the kids who come to see us, we're not sitting in the court. Remember, there was another counselor who used to work with kids in the probation office, and kind of yell at kids and put them in the detention cell, and and I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to work in that space. I wanted to have our own space, and we still work with some of those same sorts of kids and families, but removed from it, and with the goal being, how do we help people to stay out of situations in which they lose their personal freedom, right? Where they lose their ability to move about the planet at free will.
Hmm.
And being free doesn't mean doing whatever you want to do. Thanks for bleeping me there. Okay. It means, living in such a way, wisely enough, that you can avoid the system putting hooks into you, right? Or taking away your freedom. And that we have some choice that we have to make to not give away our power and give away our ability to be free. So teaching those skills to people off-site from that. Remember that building, the building where the sheriff's office is, and the probation department, and just like those little like slits where it looked like they could like shoot off the Indians or something.
Yeah, totally.
I never liked that building. It just made me nervous. It still does. If I ever have to go in there, I charge double. So
I felt that too.
it's anxiety producing, right? And
Right.
so I like to be offsite and try to keep people in, like, hey, we're going to work on how you can stay the heck out of that building, and hopefully never have to go in there again, right? And for the kids, how to stay out of detention, never have to get sent to programs, never have to get sent to places where they gotta, obey other people's directives. But that means they have to set some expectations for themselves about how they choose to do things, to not to obey the law, to be healthy, to not become addicted to another boss, which is chemical dependence, right? If we want to do what we want to do, then that's not a way to gain control of our lives. It's a way to lose control in the long run, and or on one bad night. So,
Right. So that's kind of an ongoing theme in the counseling is addiction. So it's interesting to me, the choices being analytically, that makes a lot of sense. Like, who's going to make your choices? But beneath that, it seems like you've got to work with the grace of our fundamental humanity in inspiring people enough to do that. Does that make sense? Like, where does the grace come to develop? I mean, what I'm asking, were there fundamentals of like rebuilding self-esteem, or how do you get people to check back in with themselves to give themselves enough power to make choices?
Well, it's taken me years to kind of understand how things develop, right? How people can develop, for instance, a substance use disorder, or people can develop an unhealthy pattern of living. And the way I've distilled it down, and I'll censor myself again, if you feel like you want to feel better, right? And it makes perfect sense. And so last year, a couple of years ago, I went to a training, and I'm like, oh, they found out a phrase to attach to this, to what I've seen over the years about why people tend to do what they do. And they call it trauma-informed care. And you've probably heard about something similar in the work you do, right? Where, you may be doing it on a more physical basis, right? If you're a critical care nurse, you're dealing with physical, injuries, and I'm dealing more with emotional injuries, right? People who have dealt with trauma, dealt with pain, dealt with conflict, stress, because of all those things, and then are more susceptible to wanting to feel better, and it works. And that's the thing that's really challenging about it, is that it starts out as a survival technique, and it becomes a cycle, right? That people go through in their families, or situations or communities, these situations that are traumatic, or stressful, or chronically stressful. Every time they walk in the door, they're just not sure what to expect. They're anxious, they're nervous, they're not sure, about the stability of their caregivers, the fights they watch at home, the things they deal with, physical abuse, sexual abuse, other things that people are dealing with in their lives, which I think are much more widespread than is usually acknowledged, right? And so many people who come to me, they got a diagnosis. Oh, they're bipolar. Oh, they have an oppositional defiance disorder, right? All these descriptors that say that just what the behavior is, but don't say anything about where it comes from, right?
Absolutely.
Personality disorders or whatever, conduct disorders. And very often the systems they grew up in were conduct disordered, right? And so the first time when they're 12, 13, 14 years old, somebody hands them a puff of a joint, or hands them a bottle of beer or whatever, all of a sudden they're like, oh, wow, I feel so much better now. I can laugh, I can just relax a little, and the next cycle continues, right? And very often the trauma that they're dealing with comes out of the previous generation's realization of, oh, I can manage my mood with a chemistry set. And and so the trauma, in the families and in the communities and then is passed on because they develop a new unhelpful strategy that keeps them from being present as parents, present as members of the community, right? But
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely.
That's the
Absolutely.
cycle that I see over and over with these people and families, and traumatized parents raising traumatized kids with addiction as kind of the water that helps it all flow.
Right. So they come in with these diagnoses saying, I've got a personality disorder, I've got this, I've got that. And then your job is to kind of break it down and look beyond that story and
help them to understand too, because there's stigma too, right? You beat yourself up. You're like, oh God, I'm just weak. I got a DUI. I'm a bad person. I screwed up. I knew I shouldn't do this, but I did it anyway. And you try to broaden the self blame or the blaming of others to acknowledging the way this works, right, over our lifespan, and that it makes perfect sense why we did what we did at the time that we did it. But as we grow and as we learn, we can realize and put it in a different perspective to understand why we did what we did at the time, and also understand how we can do it in a more healthy way to ourselves and others, right? And oftentimes when I see folks who are, especially through the court system, they're blaming the cop, or they're blaming whoever called the cop, or they're blaming the judge, or they're blaming these rules they resist. And usually, if you know how it is, if you're told to do something or not do something, you're like, well, watch me, I'll figure out a way to do it. You might control me for the moment, but in the end, I'm going to keep doing what I want to do, right? And so I feel like I'm as much a resistance counselor as a drug and alcohol counselor, that you're trying to help people to acknowledge that, to break that cycle of just like, you can't tell me what to do, and you might be able to catch me, but if you don't want me to do these things, then I'll do these things, and you won't be able to catch me with those things, right? And so people get into this game, right? This game of trying to get away with, as opposed to recognizing what motivated them to want to do those things in the future, right? And that the enemy becomes this thing that they've kind of idealized, the drink, the drug, whatever it is, that becomes the thing that they're focused on as like the solution, when really they have to acknowledge it's kind of that's the thing they need to realize has been something that was helpful to them at one time, but now has become maladaptive, right? Now has become something that's kept them from getting what they want in their life, including allow these other people to control them, right? And then because they can focus on those things and turn it internally. They talk a lot about, it's a kind of a buzzword now, mindfulness, right, in therapy.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is like, you say you're a resistance counselor. It's more like the art of allowing your discomfort so you can look at resisting.
Yeah, and kind of that Zen practice, right? So what you're doing is you're trying to internalize your struggle, right? And say, hey, I have this urge to do something, right? What's it feel like to sit with that and have the itch and not scratch it, right? It's a meditative process, which I suck at, by the way, the meditation process, right? I'm a busy guy, you can tell. But to sit there, and the idea is, if you have an itch, just sit there and smile at it, right? And just keep breathing and not scratch it and not even look at it. Just kind of like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen. Maybe it'll just go away, right? Maybe who knows, right? And to be able to sit there and not just fix, right? We all try to fix things, and we get really good at controlling our mood and controlling our things through chemicals sometimes, or other behaviors, right? And to just sit with it and have that empty feeling, kind of, I wasn't raised Buddhist. I'm a second generation recovering Catholic, right? But no disrespect to the Catholics, but we have to have our own practice of going internal, with acknowledging our urges and acknowledging our emotions, and being able to sit with those and link them maybe to where they came from, and being able to experience that trauma again more successfully, or without it blowing us out of the water too, right? They call it exposure therapy, is one of the ways they talk about it with PTSD, right? Where I don't know if I do that. I've really never studied up on doing it specifically, or if it's something I'm that interested in, but it makes sense to me that we all have these emotions that arise to us from our childhoods and our earlier life, and we deal with those in ways we've gotten into a habit of dealing with them, and how to be able to just sit with them and give them respect.
That's so beautiful. I was just thinking, but as a nurse, it's interesting that I got into this field, and it was kind of a discovery process to see that as a nurse, what we do is we constantly run around quickly and fix things. We're just fixing, altering, fixing pain, fixing everything. So it's just an interesting career. And I just feel that that's true, that, when you get into a career of being a nurse or in human services, and when you tend to think that you're, out there fixing all these things, checking back in with yourself just so easily gets forgotten.
Yep.
I love that. You were just reminding me of that Maya Angelou quote, do the best you can, but when you know better, do better. When you learn better, do better. So yeah, it's definitely a lifelong process sitting with discomfort. What I found myself is that the discomfort is never as scary as you think it's going to be. So there's definitely an element of courage and self-esteem. You can do it. We can do hard things. So have you felt really moved and inspired and happy when you go home at the end of the day in your practice? I mean, I'm sure it's not always easy. I'm sure it can be very heavy in comparison from your previous career, when you would go home and feel really heavy because you had to send someone to jail.
Yeah. I mean, this is what they used to say when you take kids in the woods. They say, you go to these conferences and they would call it risk management, right? They'd never call it wilderness, like risk elimination. They'd call it risk management because you can never eliminate the risk. And it's the same with self-care, right? We can manage these tensions, right? Manage these things that go through our heads and that I worry about. And it never goes away. And I have some times where I deal with them better than others. But it's a long-term practice to remember the skills that I try to teach to clients, that I should actually, practice those. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So that's that, and then you can laugh at yourself, and I think that's an important part of it, right? You got to keep a little sense of humor, that we think, that's why you said, oh, you've gotten to this place where you've mastered this stuff, and you've obviously been okay. I'm like, well, you don't know what it's like in my head, Tanya.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad.
Some days I manage it better than others, right? I mean,
yeah, I was talking
to the folks we serve, right? And
right.
And it's a thin line. And I've seen many folks, and you have too, I'm sure, who are in the helping professions, who then end up having their own crisis or struggle or don't do well. And we have to be cautious not to be that guy.
Right. Yeah. And being a leader, I was just talking to a yoga teacher that I've reached out to mentor me again. And she said, when we're leaders, when we're teachers, that's when we best show up for ourselves, because we have to show up for them. So I can see the art of practice and what you do being really similar.
We have to pay attention to some inner things, and you mentioned that, right? And some of it is psychic stuff that we have to acknowledge. And when I was a probation officer, the whole time I knew you, back, when I was a kid, the short time I knew you, but while I was working with kids in your community, right, classmates, and I would have this recurring nightmare. I had a dream, and the dream was this: I would be chasing a kid. I would catch them. I would put them in handcuffs. They would slip out of the handcuffs. They would run away. I would chase them. I would put them in handcuffs. They'd slip out, run away, over and over. It'd go on for like hours at a time, it seemed, in my dreams, right? And it was just this kind of continual knocking at my brain that this was a toxic situation for me, right? That it didn't fit with and actually I got pretty good at it. I don't know. I mean, I was a little obsessive, right? It was almost like a PTSD response. I was hyper vigilant. I would go out of town on like a vacation. I'd come back into town, my blood pressure would rise, right? And I'd be like, oh, I know who's in that house. Oh, I bet they're doing this, right? And I would get all controlling, and I became angry. My temper would come out. And I don't know if you remember that stuff, but or if you ever got to see that, but I would become kind of a scary guy. I remember kind of losing it at a van full of kids one day. A kid made a inappropriate gesture out of the back window of the van at a young lady driving past. And I luckily was not driving the van, and I just lit up the entire van, yelling at this kid. And this is after probably 9-10 years of working at probation. And I'm just like percolating in anger, right? And I'm just like, my blood pressure's up to here. And one of the kids in the back of the van, not the kid I was yelling about, one of the other kids, says to me, "Mr. Crowley, you are one scary mother."
That's hilarious because I do have one memory. I remember
Oh
being
dear. Oh no.
in a tent in the middle of
She's
the
triggered. She's
night.
triggered. Oh no.
And one of the kids on the wilderness trip was, you caught him smoking a cigarette in the middle of the night, and I'll never forget. You were like, Elliot, and I was like, oh God, I was
Don't say
like,
his last name. He hasn't signed a release.
but yeah, that's pretty funny. But to me, as a parent, I really resonate with that because my son is 17,
Well,
and when he doesn't want to come home, my lack of control for his safety is ferocious. So I really feel like you valued making movement in these kids' lives, and when you couldn't catch them, they couldn't grow. That would be the end. So I can see, that recurring dream. Do you ever still have that dream, or has it
nope.
ended? That's fantastic.
I
I
quit.
had also a recurring dream of living in a house that was haunted, and always there was a room that I couldn't go into because it was just so haunted in there. And eventually I was trying to sell the house with my husband, and I'm like, what are we going to do? No matter what we do, this room is going to be so haunted, it's going to suck our souls out. But it's interesting, really going in through my own story and addressing that haunted room, I was able to stop having that dream. So I guess it's a kind of a similar thing. Oh, okay. Okay.
The dream is there for a reason, right? It's. I mean, I'm not a big believer in like dream interpretation. I remember Albert Ellis, a great cognitive behavioral therapist who was also a real asshole. He said, analysis of dreams is a goddamn waste of time. And I went to see him speak at his conference, right? And I don't think it though. I mean, we can't really figure out exactly what it's saying, but we can pay attention to it, right? We can give it respect, right? We're like, wow, this is coming back for a reason, right? And we can, instead of like trying to turn it off, right? Oh, I just got to take my sedative every night so I don't have the dream, right? That's how we can get into an unhealthy thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's understandable because it really is uncomfortable, as you know, right? To look into this stuff it takes some courage, right? It takes a little bit of wherewithal and support, maybe through a therapy relationship,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to say, hey, this is the way to go. You're on the right track. You got to sit with this, right? We got to pay attention. If it keeps coming up, it's there for a reason, right? It's trying to tell us something. And
yeah, so the work I want to start doing is really moving away, capturing and understanding, accepting, developing resilience and acceptance, and the ability to sit with our sometimes nature to be a hungry ghost, reaching from our pain for anything that will kind of correct it, into becoming a more resilient resource that's full of connection with other people that are doing the same work. So
right.
It's so cool to reconnect with you and to see how you're connecting with yourself. The last thing that I kind of wanted to go into is, like, you talk about the humor of checking back in with yourself while you're doing this practice of working with others. Are there things that you do that you can share with us that really mean a lot to you, that recenter yourself? What's the story there? I mean,
sure. Well, I accidentally wore my Great Outdoors T-shirt. Wait, hold on a second. Keep learning, like trying to get back in the camera, and I keep going the wrong way.
I know it's just weird stream.
But I had a client actually I worked with at Douglas Mental Health, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. But he was a brilliant guy. He was a fascinating guy, very talented guy. I'm having flashbacks. When I worked in the desert, I used to rock climb with this guy, and he had this expression. He's like, yeah, we're going to the Church of the Great Outdoors. We're going to go rock climbing. We're going to the Church of the Great Outdoors, right?
5 more minutes, it'll be 12 then. Sorry.
I know you got somebody calling for you there. So the Church of the Great Outdoors, I kind of got this expression, right? And that friend actually tragically died in an avalanche in the LaSalle Mountains years ago. His name was Jeremy. But that phrase stuck in my head, and I repeated it to my client years later. This client, I'm driving someplace with him, and I remember him turning to me. He's like, "Oh, you know what that stands for?" I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Great Outdoors." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, now I do." Great Outdoors, G-O-D, right? G-O-D, Great Outdoors. And I was,
wow. Yeah,
right? That's really raised. I was, my mom, she had left the Catholic Church, St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. She just rebelled against all that. And so I really was raised neutral, right? And exposed to different philosophies. And nature, like you said, is one of the things that has been empowering to me. It's part of what brought me to the Sierras and to the outdoors. And part of what is difficult too. Like you mentioned earlier when we were talking about climate change and the fires that you guys are having in your area, and that there's this larger awareness that humanity is a little disconnected from the things that are most important and sustaining for us, literally. And that to me is a perfect place for us to put our spiritual practice and action, is towards trying to help people to realize the connectedness of the planet, right? That little circle out in space, and keeping things positive there. And it's not going too well in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
But that we not let that dissuade us from still doing the work, right? We got to know what the work is, and the work is we got to work towards a better, more sustainable future, and that includes taking good care of ourselves, right? That if we're not here, if we get down in despair, I think of that guy from 12 Years a Slave. I will not fall into despair, right? Love that guy. And I hear that in my head some days. It's like, doing the work, right? I gotta, and he wrote his book. You're right. He finally wrote his book, right? And helped people understand how we can get through difficult things, and we just have to keep working forwards and not give up. And so kind of starfish by starfish, as that old saying is, right? Or do the best we can.
The 100th monkey,
right?
Same thing. The 100th monkey, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. That whole thing, we all know it, but it's hard to do, right? We sometimes feel I sometimes feel like I'm treating the individual snowflakes on a glacier that's heading downstream and melting, right? And we can't really go there. I become a student in geology. I got a C, I think, in college. But being a rock climber, I love rocks. So sometimes if I want to give myself a bigger perspective, I'm like, I'll be like, oh, interesting. Is that igneous, or is that intrusive, extrusive? And just kind of give ourselves a little bigger perspective that we're all here for just a little blink of the eye, and we just do the best we can to live in a positive direction and help people, and try to not be a dumbass.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that about the great outdoors. I didn't, when I reached out to you, I was like, I've really discovered that my higher power is in nature, and in telling my own story. I'm almost done. In telling my own story, I was like, oh my God, you helped me to discover that. So I absolutely agree with you. So this has been just incredible, Lance. And
thanks for calling.
My son's got to get on to Zoom, but
cool, man.
Yeah, so hopefully in the future, I'd love to reconnect with you after if I need anything else for my webpage, maybe we can connect again. But I totally value your time. I appreciate you talking to me on your day off. I know it's kind of a strange request to get you to go on live. So
cool. Thank you for asking. It helps me to put it all in perspective too. So
yeah. Well, you tell Mary.
Send me the link on how I can watch this stuff that you do with via other people once you get it all set up.
Okay, great. Okay, take care, Lance.
Bye-bye.
Bye.